Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this quite chilly fall evening bordering on winter. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Wisconsin Alumni Association and Capitol Lakes Retirement Community to our UW Showcase Lecture Series. And if you haven't yet, just want to double check that your cell phones are on silent. So we are recording this lecture, so if you'd like, you can view it again online at uwalumni.com/showcase. You can also see some of our past lectures there. Also, if you're interested in some other learning opportunities, or if you've been to other lectures before, I'm happy to announce that our Global Hotspots lecture series is back. Our first lecture is Friday, November 8th, and that's at 1:30 p.m. at the Pyle Center. So if you'd like more information about that, you can chat with me on your way out. Tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Stephen Kantrowitz. He's a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin and has done some amazing research on the Civil War. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Kantrowitz.
Hi, good evening. Can you all hear me? I think they're okay. I think they're working on the volume. Maybe it's going to come up in just a minute. In the meantime, thanks for having me. Thanks, Kate, for arranging this. This lecture tonight, my talk tonight, comes out of two things, really. Out of my course on slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction, which I've been teaching at UW-Madison since 1995, and on a book that I wrote that came out last year called More Than Freedom, Fighting for Black Citizenship in a White Republic. What I want to talk about tonight is two topics that seem like one, but in fact are quite distinct. How freedom came and what freedom meant. When we think about the Civil War and about its meaning, we think about many things. We think about military combat, we think about political struggles, we think about slave emancipation. And when we think about slave emancipation, we're really hitting one of the moral touchstones in American life. One of the things that enables us, if we're so inclined, to say, yes, we had a problematic history, to say the least, but look at this remarkable transformation. And there's no doubt it is a remarkable transformation. And understanding how it happened, what the Civil War had to do with it, and what it meant that it happened. That's my purpose tonight. Now, how did freedom come? By force of arms? With the stroke of a pen? These are two powerful explanations. Each of them has been the subject of its own Hollywood film, at least. But they're each true and powerful in their own way. But tonight I want to suggest something rather different. I want to suggest that freedom came because abolitionists demanded it, because slaveholders feared it, and because slaves claimed it. Now, let me unpack each of those claims in turn. First, I want to think about abolitionists. We sometimes think of them as engines of the war, but more often they're kind of a sideline, more often a sort of clamoring minority that represents a kind of a moral conscience, but at the same time is marginal to the political conversation that's happening. And in one sense, that's true. The abolitionists are never a political force. They're never a force at the ballot box. But they are an intensely powerful social movement and force, and they do set in motion a set of transformations that lead to both the Civil War and to slave emancipation in the midst of it. The abolition movement does not begin with the gentleman on the left here. It does not begin with William Lloyd Garrison. It begins instead with a man whose picture we do not have, a man named David Walker. At least I'm going to argue it begins with him. David Walker was a free black man from North Carolina who migrated to Boston in the 1820s and became a kind of central figure in the organizing community of Black Boston. He was an agent for the first black newspapers as they emerged in that decade. He was an organizer of local self-help and mutual benevolence associations. And he was the author of a pamphlet, The Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, which he published in 1829, in which he denounced slavery and denounced Christianity for its hypocritical connivance with slaveholders, denounced the colonization movement that sought the deportation, the expulsion of free black Americans, and in the course of doing so, also reached out a hand to white Americans to say to them that we are Americans just like you. And in fact, in one stirring line in it, what a happy country this will be if the whites will listen. Walker causes William Lloyd Garrison to listen. William Lloyd Garrison had been a colonizationist. He believed that while African Americans should be free, they should probably go somewhere else. He abandons that position after steeping himself in the black community of Boston. And in the course of the 1830s, black and white activists begin coming together in the cities of the North, in New York, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in a host of smaller places, and building an interracial abolitionist movement. A movement that is transgressive, radical, in many ways that were hard for people at the time to get their heads around. Notably, the presence of black and white people sitting together. But equally notably, and very, very rare in this moment, for the presence of men and women sitting together in what was then called a promiscuous assembly, just like you all here, right? These were shocking developments, and what they signified was that the abolitionists were not going to believe in and accept old hierarchies, that they were going to reject them and were going to, in the course of challenging slavery, denouncing it as an evil, they were going to seek to overturn not just slavery, but racial caste, prejudice itself, and the caste that separated men from women, and a host of other transformations that some of them foresaw. Now, this movement does a number of things. It petitions and it protests. It also is at the beating heart of what we call the Underground Railroad, the conduit of people and sometimes institutions that helped slaves free themselves and come to freedom in the North. People like Harriet Tubman, Thomas Garrett down in Delaware, William Still in Philadelphia, who formed the basis of this network, of this movement that tried to shepherd slaves to freedom. Never very many, perhaps 1,000 a year, but at the same time, a real thorn in the side of the slaveholders. I'll talk about that in a minute. They win small victories in law. They petition and they protest and they persuade some legislatures to pass what are called personal liberty laws that defend the rights of people who are seized in the North and held as fugitive slaves in preparation for being sent back to slavery, trying to provide some measure of due process protection for those people. But their real self-assertion comes against the slaveholders, comes in the streets. They assert themselves against slavery, not just in law, not just in word, but in deed. And when slaves are captured in northern cities by the 1830s, it's not uncommon for a band of black and sometimes black and white activists together to seek freedom for that person by force of arms. In other words, to take arms against the constables, sometimes the soldiers, defending the slaveholders' claim to that person and levying war, as Henry Clay puts it, against the United States. This is a scene in Boston in 1854 when a fugitive from Virginia named Anthony Burns has been seized and is being held in the Boston courthouse in preparation for being sent back to slavery in Virginia. After a Faneuil Hall meeting at which his slavery is denounced, dozens of black and white men gather in the square outside the courthouse, pick up what's essentially a railroad tie, and beat in the door of the courthouse. Black and white men standing on either side of the beam, swinging it against the door until the door collapses, and they go inside, at which point the odds are not in their favor, and they're driven back, unsuccessful. This is such a stunning development that it causes the federal government to deputize the militia, to send in thousands of federal Marines, and to march Anthony Burns to slavery through the streets of Boston with literally hundreds of soldiers and policemen guarding him, materializing the threat to northern liberties represented by slavery in a way that nothing else ever had, and converting thousands of white people to the cause of anti-slavery. A real backfire. In the same period, abolition wins victories in politics, not as abolition, but the energy of the abolitionist movement makes it possible for many, many more people to imagine opposing themselves to slavery while not accepting the radicalism of abolition, while not investing themselves in actually interracial friendships or contacts, without investing themselves in feminism, without investing themselves, in other words, in all the things that seem pretty radical and crazy. But interestingly, being against slavery no longer seems so radical and crazy by 1850, or especially by 1860. And so an anti-slavery movement in politics can develop, not one aimed at freeing the slaves outright, but one aimed at restricting the spread of slavery into new territories. And that's the Republican Party of 1860. That's Abraham Lincoln's party. So we can see the role of the abolition movement in demanding freedom for the slaves, but what was the counter-reaction to that, the reaction on the part of slaveholders? Slaveholders were terrified. When the abolition movement emerged, it threatened to repeat the searing experiences that they had witnessed at a distance, first in Saint-Domingue, the French sugar colony of Saint-Domingue, with its 500,000 slaves, the island, or the part of the island that we now know as Haiti. The Haitian Revolution of the 1790s, led by the black general Toussaint Louverture, had created scenes that were represented in the Anglo-American and French metropole like this, as scenes of despoliation, of slaughter, of race war, of black over white. And so the slaveholders, thinking about Haiti in these terms, thought about abolition, the end of slavery, as fire and conquest and terror, as insurrection and death for themselves and for their system. More recently, they could look at a slightly less alarming but still very worrisome case, the case of the British West Indies, which in the 1830s witnessed a calamitous series of slave rebellions in Jamaica and other places, which caused the British Parliament to abolish slavery. So slave revolt could lead to terror, or slave revolt could lead to something worse, which is legislated end of slavery. And so when the slaveholders imagined the abolitionists, they imagined not just a tiny band of people preaching to each other and having very little impact, but indeed a force that could destabilize their whole system. This was why they recruited their northern allies, partisan and other allies, business interests, to oppose abolitionist speech and action, not just in the slave states where it might be heard by slaves, but in the northern states as well. This is a broadside essentially calling for a mob against an abolitionist lecture in New York. A whole wave of anti-abolitionist violence surges across the North in the 1830s and 1840s. Elijah Lovejoy, a newspaper editor in southern Illinois, an abolitionist, is murdered and his press destroyed after he won't surrender the press to a mob. When many public buildings refuse to host abolitionist meetings, abolitionists and other reformers in Pennsylvania build their own hall to meet in. And after they meet in that in an interracial assembly in 1838, a mob burns that hall down. What this culminates in is the election of Abraham Lincoln on the Republican Party platform of 1860, which calls for slavery to be barred from the federal territories and prohibited from extending past where it currently exists. Not abolition, but non-extension of slavery. And to the secession, as a direct result thereof, of South Carolina and then 10 other states. If we want to understand how powerfully the abolitionists affected these events, which led directly to the Civil War, all we have to do is recognize what South Carolinians themselves said in 1860 when they left the Union. They issued a document called the Declaration of Immediate Causes, which explained very directly why they were taking this radical step of dissolving the bonds of union and seceding from it. And they say, very simply, the Constitution was a contract which said that we had our right to slave property. And the northern states, 14 of the northern states, have gotten together and basically violated that contract. How have they violated that contract? They violated by tolerating abolition societies in their midst, by allowing them to shelter fugitives, and by passing laws that interfere with our ability to recapture those fugitives and return them to slavery. And now they've elected as president this man, Abraham Lincoln, this black Republican, Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln, no abolitionist, is identified by the slaveholders as the natural offspring of abolitionism and its creature in some ways, not as the Republicans constantly claim in 1860, the party of white men, the party of white men's right to expand into the federal territories in the West at the expense of slaveholders and slaves, but instead the black Republican, the man who has at heart the interests of black people, slaves, not white. And maybe the worst of all, in the Bill of Indictment by the South Carolinians against the North in 1860, Lincoln even accepted the votes of black men in his campaign for president. Now, how many? 2,000, maybe, in the whole country who were eligible to vote and did in the election of 1860, most of them in Massachusetts. But that alone is a sign of the great disregard for the rights of slaveholders and the system that slavery had built. But this is not the whole of the story, right? Because this caricature of abolition and of Lincoln's relationship to it has very little to do with the other reaction to abolitionism, and that's the slaves' reaction to abolitionism. Because the slaves are listening. Now, they live in a world of radically imperfect information, right? Slaves are by law illiterate, although some do become literate, like Frederick Douglass notably, and forbidden to be seen reading or to gather information. Or indeed, the slaveholders go out of their way to prevent slaves from learning about episodes of rebellion, from learning about the Haitian Revolution. They want to keep all of this very much under wraps because they don't want those thoughts to be thinkable in the slave South. Nonetheless, and probably because of this, slaves are constantly in a state of plotting or planning insurrections of one kind or another, or at the very least of plotting and planning their own escapes. So starting back in the 18th century, in places like Stono, South Carolina, and New York City, slaves rebel. And they continue to do so all through the 18th century and into the early 19th century. Several revolts in Richmond and Charleston in the early 19th century and other places, culminating in Nat Turner's rebellion, the most successful, if you want, of the American slave rebellions. Nothing like the Haitian Revolution in scale, but still a messianic movement that causes some terror in Southside Virginia for some weeks, and that leads to the death of probably 60 white people and several hundred slaves by the time all is said and done. The crackdown that follows Nat Turner's rebellion, the crackdown that follows the rise of the Abolition Movement in the North, doesn't stop slaves from trying to escape. Indeed, it seems as though slaves probably, as they learn more and more about the networks that exist to try and help them to freedom, are escaping in perhaps slightly greater numbers, not fewer. Indeed, what happens in the 1850s as the politics of anti-slavery moves into the mainstream, and as people like Abraham Lincoln begin emerging saying, Anthony Burns should not have been returned to slavery, or slavery should be barred from the federal territories, and winning at the ballot box in the North, this is when slaveholders begin to denounce Republicans as black Republicans. And this is when slaves begin paying attention to Republicans. They get it. They don't get it the way the slaveholders mean it. The slaveholders are trying to create bonds of union between themselves, their white allies in the North, and the non-slaveholding white people of the South. But they have the unintended consequence of persuading slaves that they may actually have allies, more allies and more powerful allies than they thought they did. these warnings about black Republicans also backfire in that they persuade slaves that all forms of anti-slavery are tantamount to abolition and are going to lead to their ultimate freedom. Just two anecdotes from the South in the election of 1860 to kind of underline this point. One editor in Macon complains that every political speech delivered in this city has attracted a number of Negroes who, without entering the hall, have managed to linger around and hear what the orators say. Very dangerous business. That same fall, 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln, 60 slaves marched through New Castle, Kentucky, singing political songs and shouting for Lincoln. Now, Lincoln is not promising their freedom, but their masters have been saying that he is, and they're paying attention. Slaves, in other words, build a hypothesis by 1861, and that hypothesis is that the election of Abraham Lincoln foretells the end of slavery. Once the war begins, slaves test that hypothesis. How do they test that hypothesis? The Union Army shows up in the forts and camps that it still occupies in the slave states. And slaves show up at those forts to see what will happen. In May 1861, 3 fugitives present themselves at the gates of Fortress Monroe on the peninsula in Virginia. And they're interviewed at the gate, and they're brought in to talk to the commanding general who's just arrived, a conservative Democrat, and not an anti-slavery man, from Massachusetts named Benjamin Butler. In fact, kind of a pro-slavery Democrat from Massachusetts, if there's such a thing as imaginable. Benjamin Butler interviews them, and they tell him what they told the man at the gate, that they were slaves in Virginia, and that their master had sent them to be put to work on a Confederate fortification in the seceded state of Virginia. Butler listens to this and reasons as follows. If they are property, which the law of the United States says they are, and the Confederacy, of course, claims they are, and if they are property that is being put to military use in the war against the Union, and if, as that form of property, they've fallen into Union hands, he's actually forbidden by the Articles of War from returning them to their owners. They are contraband of war, using the logic of slavery against the slaveholders and on behalf of the slaves. And so it is that fugitive slaves, sometime in the summer of 1861, stop being called fugitive slaves and start being called contraband. And so they remain until pretty late in the war. These are not the last 3 people to show up at Fortress Monroe. We might see them as a kind of brave test market, right? They go out and they check out the scene. It could have gone very badly. They could have been sent back to their owners. They could have been whipped very badly, or something even more terrible, an exemplary punishment could have happened to them. But no, they get to stay. And because they get to stay, hundreds and then thousands more follow. Literally tens of thousands of slaves begin fleeing their masters on the peninsula of Virginia and heading to Fortress Monroe, because they've learned they will not be returned to slavery, or at least not be returned to their owners if they get there. So the Stampede, this famous event in May of 1861 where the sentries start looking out the gates of Fortress Monroe, and there are literally hundreds of slaves in the middle of the night running toward the fort. This was a strategy of slaves sometimes. They knew that if they all ran at once, there wasn't the manpower to corral them, and so they would occasionally try it, but usually there was nowhere to go. So they would scatter into the swamps and then be picked off one by one. But here, there's somewhere to go. This is the great error the slaveholders have made in seceding, is that they have created islands of refuge for slaves where there were none before. And this is the great genius of the contraband policy, is in recognizing that. The contraband arrive at Fortress Monroe in numbers and numbers and numbers, and they are immediately put to work. Butler, of course, puts the able-bodied men to work, reasoning that they would be put on Confederate fortifications. He can't send them back, they're weapons of war. And of course, those able-bodied men do the work of military labor, freeing up white Union soldiers from having to do that duty and freeing them up for combat and other purposes. But Butler takes in women and children too. And the women work as laundresses and as servants and as cooks. By really no later than the fall of 1861, Union soldiers and officers at Fortress Monroe are treating them as an essential part of their military effort, not as a burden, a refugee burden on their fort, but indeed as a great aid in the military campaign, which is not going so well in military terms, in Virginia in that period. Not only do slaves serve as laborers and as servants and as laundresses and all the rest, they also serve as spies. Benjamin Butler runs a spy network out of Fortress Monroe. And who are the spies who you can send across lines into the Confederacy? Black people, especially black people who were slaves, because they know the terrain, they know how a slave speaks to a slaveholder, and they know how slaves speak to each other. And that makes them the perfect spies for this theater of war. Abraham Galloway was born in North Carolina, just like David Walker, and escapes slavery in the 1850s in the hold of a ship, takes him to Philadelphia. From there, he enters a wild and woolly world of the abolitionist underground. He's with John Brown here and there. He's sailing to Haiti at one point to foment, to bring back soldiers to fight. He's engaged in all kinds of wonderful stuff that my colleague David Ciesielski's written about in his book about him. In 1861, Galloway shows up at Fortress Monroe, first working as a spy for Benjamin Butler, then working as a spy master, running 50 spies out of Fortress Monroe and bringing the information back and collating it for Butler. By 1863, when Butler is long gone, but Galloway is still around in the Chesapeake, still doing this work, he is of such importance to the Union cause that when he says, "My mother is still a slave in Wilmington, North Carolina," the last Confederate-held port on the coast at that point, really, on the Atlantic coast. "My mother is still a slave in North Carolina, and I want you to get her out," which involves disguising a ship, a blockade runner, disguising an American warship as a blockade runner, having a crew pretend to be sailors instead of Union soldiers, getting in, finding one enslaved woman in New Bern, North Carolina, and getting her out. It's an incredible job. It's a ridiculous thing to ask. And 3 Union generals correspond until they figure out how to do it, and they do it. That's how important Abraham Galloway is to their war. But it's not only spies, it's also people who become soldiers and sailors. Robert Smalls is a slave in Charleston, South Carolina, who's been working as a boilerman on a stolen, or I should say an appropriated American warship, which has become a Confederate Coast Guard vessel, basically, guarding the harbor in Charleston. But, you know, as with any majority slave society like South Carolina, slaves do most of the work. And so slaves are most of the crew of this steamship going around Charleston Harbor, and they sleep on the ship like the rest of the crew, but the crew don't like to sleep on the ship, and if they don't have to, they won't. So there's a lot of nights when there's really no white men on the boat at all. So Smalls and his band wait until the time is right, and they organize their families, and they get their families together on a night when there are no white Confederate sailors on the ship, and they get them on board, and they fire up the boilers at 2 o'clock in the morning, and they sail out into Charleston Harbor. They steam out into Charleston Harbor toward Fort Sumter. And Smalls, depicted here, Smalls puts on the captain's uniform, stands where the captain stands, gives the appropriate salutes, because of course it's slaves who are doing all this work all the time, right? Gives the appropriate salutes, and they sail past the battery at the fort. And when they're out of range of the guns, they bring down the Confederate flag, and they put up a white bedsheet that they've brought with them, and they take it right to the Union lines, to the Union blockade, just outside the range of the guns. And Smalls climbs up onto the deck to the amazement of the Yankee captain standing there and says, "I have one of President Lincoln's ships. I thought he might want it back." He's commissioned a captain in the Union Navy. And all of this is to say, all of this is to say that the actions of the slaves themselves play a critical role in transforming this war, and in transforming the meaning of the war, and in making enslaved people's freedom intelligible to people who had not thought that was possible, who thought that was dangerous, who had thought it meant Haiti, right? Now begin to see it as Robert Smalls. It looks a little different once it's actually happened. Congress begins responding to this reality. It abolishes slavery in the federal territories. It abolishes slavery in the District of Columbia. It allows the employment and payment of black men as military laborers, and their payment wages, which they had not been paid at Fortress Monroe, but now are able to be paid as military laborers. In 1862, it goes so far as to free the slaves of all rebel slaveholders, but creating a very cumbersome judicial mechanism for doing that actually no one ever takes advantage of. The military itself begins defending fugitives, not just a handful of generals like Butler, but by policy. Generals begin, and the generals are ordered, in fact, not to return slaves to their owners. And indeed, this goes so far as to prevent loyal slaveholders in the 4 slave states that have not left the Union, preventing them from recapturing their slave property. That's how far things have gone by the fall of 1862, which is when Lincoln moves to a policy of emancipation. First, he tries to persuade the border state slaveholders to accept compensation for their slaves, saying, you're going to lose them anyway, so let us pay you for them. Nothing doing. They won't have it. Simultaneously, Lincoln's trying to persuade African Americans that while they're probably going to get to be free, they should also probably think about leaving. Lincoln's always been a proponent of colonization, and he remains so during the Civil War until nearly its end. Telling a delegation of African Americans to the White House that you, of course, are suffering a great wrong, but we really can't live together here, and I cannot change this if I would. It's better for us to separate, and that means for you to go somewhere else. Yet, this commitment of Lincoln's to a white republic does not prevent him from issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, first announcing that he'll do that in September of 1862, and then finally actually doing it on January 1st, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation does 2 really striking things that recognize the slaves' activity. First, it only frees slaves where slaveholders are still in power. So it essentially says, all of you who are still under the rule of slavery are free if you can get to us. Lincoln creates a set of incentives for slaves to imagine themselves as free people and to get to freedom by saying, once you get here, you're free. The second thing he does in the final Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, is open the door to the enlistment of black men in the Union Army. And that is a big step forward. Beginning in really even before he's announced the proclamation, but then especially in the winter after, in 1863, begin recruiting the sort of first test regiments. And they go to the place where they think it's going to be the safest to do it, the place with the best organized, tightly knit black community, with a dense abolition network, with the place that had voted overwhelmingly for Lincoln, that was very anti-slavery to its core, Massachusetts. And goes to the governor of Massachusetts, himself an abolitionist, John Andrew, and asks him to recruit a black regiment. Andrew turns to a network of businessmen and asks them to do the job, and they turn to the black activist community of Boston and the greater North and say, how do we do this? And they begin, recruiting men to the 54th, and by the spring of that year, they're organized, and by the summer of that year, they're in South Carolina, storming Battery Wagner. A failed assault, but one that demonstrates both their bravery, their capacity for military discipline, and also in the way that sort of heroic defeats will sometimes do, is a spur to others to enlist. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 black men will serve in the Army or the Navy of the United States. And after the Emancipation Proclamation, as the war becomes a war of emancipation, which it had not been before, It's also a war fought partly and increasingly by former slaves themselves and by free blacks of the North, who, although a relatively small population, serve in numbers that dwarf any other northern enlistment pool. 71% of the militarily eligible free black men of the North serve in the Union Army. You have to go to the Confederate South, where conscription is brutal and goes to the bottom of the manpower pool to get percentage that's higher than that. These are volunteers. In 1864, the Senate passes the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, and the House, as Steven Spielberg has told you, follows in January of 1865. The states ratify the 13th Amendment that December, after Lincoln's death. Slavery is done. And that freedom, had something to do with the Union Army, had something to do with Abraham Lincoln, also had something to do with abolitionists and slaveholders, and especially slaves. Let me turn in the last 10 minutes or so to what freedom meant. Now, some context is important here because we have two ideas joined at the hip in our imaginations and in our kind of national creed, and that is freedom means equality. If people are truly free, that means they're also equal. That is not a 19th century idea, at least not yet. Not in 1863, it's not. Freedom did not mean social or political equality in this context. For Lincoln and other colonizationists, freedom should be coupled with deportation. For British West Indian plantation societies, Jamaica, freedom, when it came, had to be followed by a strict regime of regimentation, apprenticeship, labor discipline, nothing like equality, certainly no right to vote, nothing that would threaten the economic system. And indeed, when the Union invades the Confederacy in the early years of the war, and really almost down to the end of the war, and when Northern reformers flock into those occupied areas to seek to prove that freedom can work, what they want to prove is that even if slaves are freed, they will still grow cotton for the market for very low wages. And that is exactly what happens on the Sea Islands of South Carolina when the Union invades and occupies starting in the end of 1861. They turn it into free labor cotton plantations. And former slaves in those territories are not free to reject wage labor for cotton. They are not free to establish subsistence farms. They are not free to fish or forage or hunt on their own. They have to be disciplined as wage laborers. Freedom doesn't mean equality. Freedom means the freedom to do what we think is the right thing for you to do. There's further precedent for that, and that is the status of free black people in the North, where they are free, but even in Massachusetts, not socially or politically equal. In most states, free black people lack the right to vote. Nowhere can they serve on juries, and everywhere are they the subject of mobs and mockery. The most popular form of public entertainment in the mid-19th century is the minstrel show. And broadsides like this, you can't read the captions here, I'm sorry, but caricatures of black people's aspirations and dignity are widespread. They vastly exceed, in their sort of how prolific they are across the North, they vastly exceed the percentage of black population in the North. In other words, black people's aspirations and dignity are a widespread subject of mockery, even where there are very few black people. In the nation at large, they've been deemed non-citizens by the Dred Scott decision of 1857, and even before that have been denied the right to serve in the militias on the basis of the Federal Militia Act, which only enrolls able-bodied white men. Robert Morris, one of my favorite activists from 19th century Boston, spends a decade contesting his exclusion from the militia and the exclusion of black men generally from those kinds of offices with no success at all. They're denied the right to enlist in the Union Army when the struggle begins in 1861. And even after 1863, the presumption of their inequality ends up governing their payment as Union soldiers, because when the first soldiers arrive to get their pay envelopes in the camps of the 54th and 55th Massachusetts, they discover that the military bureaucracy of the Union refuses to see them as soldiers, though they had been promised soldiers' wages. It says the only terms under which black people may serve in the Union Army is as military laborers, and therefore you get laborers' pay, which is $10 a month, less a clothing allowance because laborers wear out their clothing. So effectively $7 a month, not the $13 that Union privates get. What follows is a broad campaign for equality within the Union Army, and it takes two forms. First, it takes the form, on behalf of Robert Morris and his friends, of refusing to enlist. Now, we think of the 54th as a proud regiment representing abolitionist Boston, but in fact, Robert Morris and his friends are so angry about the military's refusal to incorporate black officers, and later about the military's refusal to pay equal wages, that they lead a campaign against recruitment for the 54th. And in Boston, at least, they succeed. When the 1,000 men of the 54th marched through Boston in May of 1863 on their way to South Carolina, there are 40 guys from Boston in its ranks. And one of the leading black recruiters for the regiment says, "It is never to be too much regretted, this combination that came up. We didn't expect it, but so many young men have given up the chance to fight in the 1st Regiment, and it's a tragedy." And Robert Gould Shaw, the white colonel of the regiment, simply says, "The leading colored men of Boston have done us more harm than good." Once the regiments are at war and discover that they're not going to be paid, they go on strike. Now, in some cases, they actually literally strike. They mutiny. They stack their arms. That's an ineffective form of protest against the Union, because, or at least seems to be an ineffective form of protest against the Union. It leads to some black non-commissioned officers to be court-martialed and executed by the Union. A more effective form of strike is the pay strike, the refusal to take pay, and thereby shame the Union into paying them equally. White activists, even radical abolitionists, don't get what's going on. They think that the black soldiers are angry because they're not being paid enough. And even the governor of Massachusetts thinks this, and he sends his adjutant down to talk to the men of the 55th who won't take their pay and to say to them, Massachusetts has raised enough tax revenue to make up the difference, and we'll pay the other $6. So you'll be making 13, so it'll be equal now, okay? And the sergeant of the 55th has to explain to the adjutant, it's not about the money. It's about the principle. We're not mercenaries. The principle is that we fight and die as equals in this society. And if we're not being paid equally by the federal government, it doesn't matter what we're being paid. And the adjutant goes back to Governor Andrew and says, I didn't understand what was going on. I'm actually on their side. They're totally right. What we see here is that military service, black military service in the Civil War, is a balancing act. These are two regimental flags of two of the regiments of U.S. colored troops. And in one, you see the respectable, dignified, citizenry as gentlemen, right? And in the other, you see the other face that the gentleman must always have if he's going to turn his, if he's going to be able to defend his rights, which is the fearsome face of the soldier, the fighter, the killer, even. I did skip over one person I don't want to leave out while I'm finishing up here, and that is, the abolition movement had not just been a movement of men, and although the rhetoric and the confrontations that take place in the midst of the Civil War tend to be between and among men, women are everywhere and active in this struggle too. This is Christiana Carteau Bannister, who's she has a chain of beauty stores in Boston, and her husband is the famous painter Edwin M. Bannister. She stands up in a public meeting in the midst of the pay strike and says, "My husband is not going." We don't know what her husband had to say about this. She just decides her husband is not going to war because he's not going to be paid as an equal soldier, an equal citizen, and therefore no one should serve unless they can be treated in that way. Ultimately, Frederick Douglass's prognostication of 1863 turns out to be right. Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S., let him get an eagle on his button and musket in his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on the earth or under the earth which can deny that he has earned the right of citizenship in the United States. And indeed, citizenship does seem to follow from military service. Even Abraham Lincoln, by the spring of 1864, is beginning to utter those thoughts himself. He writes in a private letter to the provisional governor of occupied Louisiana, "I barely suggest for your private consideration whether some of the colored people may not be let in as voters, as, for instance, the very intelligent and especially those who have fought gallantly in our ranks. They would probably help in some trying time to come keep the jewel of liberty in the family of freedom." So by the time the colonizationist Abraham Lincoln is able to imagine black soldiers as part of the family of freedom, something dramatic has happened. And what's happened is black people have changed the terms of the conversation about freedom to one that centrally involves equality. And by the summer of 1865, that's part of a national conversation in which the expectation becomes clear that black people, black men, are going to get the right to vote as a consequence of having served in the Civil War armies, and therefore some measure of equal citizenship is going to follow. And indeed, in the 15th Amendment, which is ratified in 1870, that comes to pass. Now, that's a happy story, right? That's actually one of our favorite national stories. But we also know that the sequel to that story is the violence and terror of Reconstruction, in which black aspirations to freedom and dignity and self-determination are squashed, first by the Ku Klux Klan and by similar vigilante activity in the South, but also by legislative disregard in the North and by a Supreme Court that is entirely willing to let both of those things go forward. Until by the end of the 1870s, black political power in the South has essentially been destroyed, and the conditions have been laid for the creation of the Jim Crow South, which will last legally until 1965. So I think what we have to recognize is that there's another story here too, and that project of tying freedom to equality actually did not succeed. That it has been at best a weak knit. It's not a fracture that healed well. It's a fracture that has remained fragile and that is not easily solved. And we can see this in the New York City draft riots of 1863, when white mobs string up black men, burn down the orphanage for black children. We can see this in the northern rhetoric of Reconstruction. This is a Pennsylvania broadside from the late 1860s, from the mid-1860s, I'm sorry, in which the choice is framed, as it was in that earlier depiction of Abraham Lincoln, as the choice is framed as one between white freedom or black freedom. But if black people are free, it will somehow come at white people's expense. If black people are compensated in any way for slavery, that it will be only at the expense of white people, as though justice and democracy were racially zero-sum games. And these images, so familiar to African Americans of the mid-19th century from the broadsides and minstrel shows and the rest, these images persist as images of black incapacity, frailty, degradation, really unfitness for citizenship. Just this spring, in trying to warn us against a renewed housing bubble, the editors of Bloomberg Businessweek decided to frame the question in exactly these terms that would have been very familiar to the Democratic broadside writers of 1866. And so the charge left to us is the same charge that the slaves and free black activists of the mid-19th century would have left us with, which is, I don't know what they would say if they could see this. If Frederick Douglass could appear among us and look up at this and understand how little the world had changed since his nemesis Andrew Johnson had gone to the great beyond. What he would say if he saw a country in which one black man is president and 1 out of 4 can expect to be incarcerated at some point in his life. I know that he wouldn't give up the fight, and I hope we won't either. Thank you.
Thank Thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We do have a few minutes for questions, so if you have a question, raise your hand, and Lauren and I will be walking around with the microphone. First question.
Don't be shy, I'm very nice.
Here we go.
When we were in North Carolina this spring, we went to a former plantation.
Mm-hmm.
And there they referred to the people as enslaved workers. They never used the term slaves. I take that back. She did one time and she said, "Excuse me, enslaved workers."
That's really interesting. There's a whole language politics around talking about slaves, and it actually, in some circles of conversation, that's considered more respectful, not a whitewash of slavery, but instead a way of talking about enslaved people as people first and as the sort of status property relation second. I think there's a lot to be said for that. I use slaves as shorthand all the time. Slaves did too. I think, we want to think about language all the time. We don't want to tie ourselves in knots so much about it that it becomes the point of the conversation. I've been on plantations, fortunately not recently, but I've been on plantation tours where slaves were referred to as owned help, which, that's a different thing, right? That indicates a serious desire to say anything but slave, or indentured servants, as if there were an indenture they could work out, right? That's a different thing. I think enslaved workers is a perfectly reasonable alternative in my view. Yeah?
What role did the Quakers play in the abolitionist movement?
The Quakers played a vast role in the abolition movement. Now, not every Quaker was an abolitionist, this must be said. Though, in the nature of these things, the Quakers would like to claim abolition generally. And understandably, there were a disproportionate number of Quakers in the abolition movement, and a disproportionate number of Quakers were abolitionists. And some of the leading figures, especially in Pennsylvania abolition movement, were Quaker, and also out in the West. But the abolition movement is anything but a sectarian movement, right? In fact, in some ways, it's the opposite of a sectarian movement because it is so heterodox. Whoops, I knew I was going to lose this at some point. The abolition movement is so heterodox in its view of Christianity and in its religious, in its theology, that there's really no way for it to fit into an established church. And abolition, in fact, causes huge schisms within Quaker congregations into the 1850s. So there's, the glass is, in this case, usually the glass is like 80% empty and 20% full. In this case, the glass is about half full, actually, in the case of the Quakers, but only about half full. Yeah?
The popular writers such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, response, influence, what happened?
Yeah. So there's the famous story, of course, that probably not true, but telling story anyway, that Harriet Beecher Stowe shows up at the White House and Abraham Lincoln says, "So you're the little woman who caused this big war." That's a telling story about the impact of Uncle Tom's Cabin, because for many, many white people in the North and in the South, but especially in the North, who had no interaction, no meaningful social contact with slaves or with black people at all, Uncle Tom's Cabin became the way they understood and emotionally read themselves into the dilemma of slavery. And the conclusions that book asks you to draw are not complicated, right? It asks you to see slavery as a grotesque moral evil and one that can poison any society, including Northern society, not just a handful of slaveholders and slave traders, but an entire society, North and South, poisoned by it. So that book's enormously influential. It's the best-selling novel of the 19th century. It's translated instantly. It goes through hundreds of reprints and pirated editions. There's no book that has the impact in the 19th century that book does, and well into the 20th. When films are first made, like there are 7 films of Uncle Tom's Cabin made in the early 20th century. It remains transcendently popular. It's only really in the second half of the 20th century that it begins fading from view as a popular text. But I read it when I was starting to teach my Civil War and Reconstruction class, and I stayed up all night and I wept. I had the same, of course, I'm a 19th century historian, so I might be primed for that. But I had a 19th century sentimental reaction to it in the 20th century, It's a very powerful book.
I have a question. If it's appropriate for you, I don't know. And I got the impression from some of the things you're saying that you're also interested in what's going on today here.
Yeah.
And we're in a room where I don't believe there are any people of African descent, unless they're people who don't indicate it in their appearance anymore.
Which is always possible.
The idea of equality would have to do with, what we think it means to be a human being. And I'm wondering what your suggestion is for people today. And I would like to ask the possibility that the challenge is for each person to look into how they think they are, if they are a human being, if they are equal in value to everyone else, and what does that mean about how I might behave and how I think about myself? Because that, to me, is the question.
I think that's a very interesting question. I also have a slightly different perspective on it, in that I think sometimes by framing the question as what I can do myself, when we're confronting centuries-long dynamics that seem intractable and insuperable, I'm talking about white supremacy here, right? When we confront those as individuals, we actually are powerless, except at the margins, except in our individual reactions. But we're not powerless as collectives, and we're not powerless institutionally. We have the ability to say there are places and situations in which we can actually invest ourselves in the world in a way that works against the history of white supremacy. And there are very practical ways. We can invest ourselves in the public schools. We can ask our children and grandchildren to invest ourselves in the public schools, because we have very, very few public spheres left that are genuinely democratic, that genuinely are open to everybody, in which, indeed, in the case of the public schools, everyone is compelled to be part of them. It is really the only place we have that's like that. And if we don't save it, if we don't treat it with enormous respect and make sure that we invest ourselves in it as individuals and as communities, then I don't think that small d democracy has very much chance. On the other hand, if we do, I think it does. So I think it might be as simple as that in a certain way, as complicated as that in another way, because investing yourself in the public school system means accepting radical imperfection. It means accepting teachers of enormous goodwill and good training who are overwhelmed by the circumstances they find themselves in, and bureaucracies that are ill-equipped to face the kind of changing demographics and changing circumstances of their students. So it's really complicated and difficult. But I think that's the one thing I would say. I clearly did not reach that. I lost her, but I do believe that.
We have one more question for the large group.
I want to go back to the sectarian comments that you made, and if I heard you correctly, I think you said that the Quakers were split about down the middle. Half the Quakers were abolitionist.
Earlier in the 19th century, that's the case. Later on, that's not the case.
And then I noticed in the slides that one of the Southern movements was held at a Presbyterian church. But at least some of the major denominations, the Methodists, for example, of which I'm one, actually split at that time.
So did the Baptists, so did the Presbyterians. Yeah.
So you must have had the Northern Methodists pretty much in the abolitionist camp. Yes or no?
Well, abolitionist is too strong, but what splits the Methodist Church is whether the church as a whole can accept a bishop who's a slaveholder, right? And a significant fraction, entirely northern, says no, a slaveholder cannot be a bishop in the Methodist Church. And that's where they split. Now, the Presbyterians and Baptists have their own, they're structured differently as denominations. They have their own particular ruptures, and in fact, the Presbyterians split about 4 ways. But it's always the same story. It's, can we be in fellowship with slaveholders as Christians? And the anti-slavery answer is no. Now, not everybody who took that position was an avowed abolitionist, wanted the immediate uncompensated emancipation of the slaves, and imagined them as equal citizens of the same republic, right? Not everybody. But the unwillingness to tolerate slaveholding fellowship, that was a really important and significant move, yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Everybody,
Thanks.
please join me in welcoming some Badger goodies.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again, everyone. We'll be back on Thursday, November 21st with Professor Mark Loudon in Who Are the Amish? So hope to see you again soon. Have a great night, and on Wisconsin.